Hi, I'm Susan Tomasic. Pronouns are she and her. I am a white woman with curly blonde hair, and I'm wearing a green shirt. Background is a tan wall, and you might be able to see a little bit of a black tray with painted flowers on it. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, I'm Matt Seeley. I'm the director of the Statewide Independent Living Council in Pennsylvania. I guess my pronouns are he and him, although I'd rather you just call me Matt. I've been the director here, I think going on 6 or 7 years. Geez, time flies so fast. I am a white man with really thin hair. Don't point at me. I have a blurred background as well, so really nothing to describe there. I'm wearing a black t-shirt though. So this session, we're talking about what happens when a SILC closes. We really, Susan, Kathy, and I really want this to be an interactive session. So if you have any questions, they gave you the instructions there a minute ago, but feel free to pop your hand up at any point when you have a question. We want to bring things to the table, but we also looking forward to taking things away, ways that we can improve situations in our states. So please ask questions whenever you want. And from there, Kathy, I think you're going to start off, or no, we're starting off. So Pennsylvania, okay. We're going to first talk about how the Pennsylvania network is set up. Do you want to take that, Susan?
So the Pennsylvania IL network is the SILC. And we have 17 centers for independent living. Some of them are federally funded, some of them are Part B funded, and one is dually funded. And our DSE is our Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. So we do try to include other organizations in the state, such as the DD Council and a few others, and we encourage any kind of state representation from the government, from the different offices that affect people with disabilities to come to our quarterly meetings.
Just one clarification. We have basically half of our centers are federal and half of them are state funded. We have separate state legislation that sets up direct funding for our state funded centers. It passes through VR, but it's not technically Part B.
So next slide. All right, so the Kansas SILC, or the Kansas network. Kansas is a minimally funded state when it comes to Part B. We have 10 centers, 6 of those are Part C centers, and 4 of those are Part B or state general funds funded. We do have quite a bit of funding that Kansas, well, quite a bit. I mean, I don't know if it's ever quite a bit. We have some additional funding, that's probably a better way to say it, in Kansas, where they use extra state general funds, Social Security reimbursement, and that kind of things. And that helps fund those other 4 centers, as well as co-fund the other 6 Part C centers, except for 1. Our IL network, what we consider the IL network is the SILC and the 10 centers. We do have meetings with our DSE, which is the Vocational Rehabilitation Office, but we do have what we call IL network meetings, where it's just the directors of the centers and myself, and we meet probably 3 to 4 times a year, and we talk about all the different things that we need to be a unified voice on for the state. Our centers don't all agree on everything. They certainly don't serve all the same types of communities, but we do see the benefit in coming together like this, especially for things like trying to get legislative line item funding, a formula. We've developed that. You'll see later on in the presentation some of our language from our spill, but we actually came together and all decided upon how to fund or how to come up with a formula when additional money comes in. So that's pretty much how the Kansas network is set up. Probably ready for slide 4.
Okay, so our current state in Pennsylvania, our current state plan language is on the slide. We've had a number of centers, I mean, off the top of my head, I believe 4 or 5, that have either closed or been restructured in some way where we had to eventually put language in our state plan. And again, our situation is a little bit different because we have both state funded and federally funded centers with different, well, the federal centers don't have a designated state entity similar to like a VR, but we have to work very closely with VR when dealing with the state funded centers where we wouldn't, you know, the ACL with the federal centers. Want to add something to?
So basically, in the event, I'm just going to paraphrase, if a Part C federally funded SIL can no longer provide its services and statutory obligations, they are required, according to our spill, to notify ACL, and we are to be notified as well. And we will work with them to try to come to some agreement in which the consumers will not lose any of their services or be in any way harmed by this. We'll do whatever we can to make sure there's no interruption of services. Expectation of privacy is observed by all. There's going to have to be a reasonable sampling of some of the consumer files for review, for in-person monitoring, but we're here to act as the advocate on behalf of the consumers.
But that language there, the reasonable sampling of consumer files, is for the state-funded centers. And I would note that, I mean, Pennsylvania is not proactive. We didn't have this language. This situation happened a number of times, like I said. And the most recent time, a federal center went basically bankrupt. And ACL came to where we went to ACL. What do we do? What do we do? And they said, well, what does your spill say? Hence, now this is what our spill says. Next slide. So I mean, the first paragraph still deals with Part C funded federal centers, and then that last paragraph would deal with our state funded centers. So if the funding in the Part C center is relinquished or terminated because they're not living up to their up to the law, that's what will happen. And then the state funded center, basically, the SILC has more to say in it, and the state law has more to say in it. But the essence is the same. We're trying to prevent centers from closing, but if a center does close, like Susan said, we're trying to minimize the impact on consumers to the best of our ability. Next slide.
Okay, so in Kansas, we've had 4 centers close, I think, in the last 15 years. And as I'm thinking back on those, none of them have been Part C centers. So that's a good thing. But it does show you the volatility of the Part B funded centers. And I'll kind of go into like what we dealt with and some of the things that happened. Here's some of our spill language. It's, you know, it's the very general type of language about maintaining continuity of services, offering the supports, minimizing the disruption of services to people to be served. It says if the Part C SIL either relinquishes or has its award terminated, that they will collaborate with ACL. The first priority will be guaranteed continuation of services, and that the redistribution of funds relinquished by the terminated or the termination of a SIL will follow the guidelines, and then we go on. So the next slide, I think it's number 7, please. So this is where we get into kind of the nitty gritty of when a center closes, or when additional funding comes in for whatever reason. And I think it's important to have this kind of stuff in here. This is mostly like the federal money. If long-term, and we made that distinction because, you know, we all got the ARA money, and that was nice to get money, but what a pain in the butt it turned out to be. And it actually hurt some centers. So we put the distinction in there, long-term Part C funds up to 50,000. And then we've got long-term funds greater than 50,000. And we go into all of them. And you'll notice that in all of our language, we have in there that the centers and the SILC will collaborate. We've got the network listed in there, that we've developed a formula for distribution of any additional funds. And then we go into, if there's long-term funds greater than $570,000, and I'm sure most of you all know that number, recognize it. April did the big study. We've taken it directly from the research and the findings that they came up with. And that's actually what we have in our spill as what we would like as base funding. And anytime we talk to our DSC about additional funding, or when a center closes, or the thought of a new center, we always talk about that 570 number. So we have that in here. And then let's go to slide number 8, please. So this is just the rest of our language. And again, like I said, we haven't had a Part C center close in at least 15 years. And quite honestly, I'm trying to think back if we ever had a Part C center close, and nothing comes to mind. I've been in IL in Kansas for, well over 20 years, and I cannot remember a Part C center closing. So, but we have experienced what we call Part B funds, or Part B centers, I'm sorry, closing. And so we wrote in quite a bit of language in our spill about that. And it came in handy because, like I said, we've had 4 centers close in the last 15 years. And the last center that closed was probably within the last 4 or 5 years. And, you know, our DSC, even though we had this language in the spill about what they're supposed to do, that they're supposed to identify how much money is left, what type of money is left for that center, and then they're supposed to take our recommendation, the network's recommendation. They're supposed to come together with the SILC and the centers and make sure what's the most effective way to continue to serve people. Kansas has 105 counties, and all 105 counties are covered by a center with services. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. But what happened was, in this last center, it closed. Actually, they closed themselves. They decided that the model wasn't working for them, that they wanted to do something different, and they closed the center. And another center, which happened to be a Part C center, came in and took over that area. They had 3 counties in Kansas, and they're pretty metropolitan area. It's the Kansas City, Kansas area of Kansas. And they took that over. But unfortunately, what didn't happen in the beginning was the DSC just said, oh, well, the SIL is closing. It's so great that they've notified us and that they have a solution already for us. But they hadn't reached out to the rest of the network. And so we had to stop them. I had to literally go to the governor's office and say, now, wait a minute, we've got to follow the spill. And we need to at least be able to get together as a network and come up with effective ideas. And so they stopped the process and they kind of rewound, and we did that. We all met, and we met with the DSC, and we talked about a lot of different things, and they put out an RFP for it, and we went that way. And it you know, honestly, it ended up getting to the same center that was originally going to take it. But this way, the network felt that they had done the due diligence, and then we learned from that too, because then we had the next spill come up. We learned from that, and we put some more language in there about that. This is why it's important. This is what we want to happen. And so I guarantee you our DSE is much more familiar with our spill language now than they were 3 years ago. And just a little more history on the 4 centers that closed. all 4 of them basically were absorbed by another center. So we have centers for independent living in Kansas that cover 38 counties, and that's a huge territory. But we've never had another SIL just be able to come in and open and stay open for more than probably 2 years, 2 to 3 years. It's a tough process to have happen. And I think that's why it's important to have the network behind it. So I know I've just talked a whole lot. So again, if you guys have questions or want to jump in, please do that.
Should say we've got a lot of language in here that people may be interested in or maybe want to avoid, whatever the case may be. Our emails are at the end of the presentation. Feel free to reach out to us and we can shoot you a copy of our spill or the section you're interested in. And similar to Kathy's area, I said we had 5 or 6 centers closed in recent memory. I think only one of them actually closed, and ACL rebid that out to another SIL that was in the area, and it remained a Part C funded area. But the other centers, which was a mix of them, all were. What ended up happening was another SIL came in and kind of rehabbed them back to health, with whether it be a new director or whatever that SIL needed. They were kind of fixed. If you catch my meaning.
Matt, this is Melly. Sorry to interrupt, but we do have a question, and that is if you could share what the difference between a Part B and a Part C center is.
That was for me.
That's for anyone, I believe.
Part B is the funding that goes to the state, usually for projects and whatnot. It can go to the funding of a center for independent living. Part C is the funding that goes directly to federally funded centers, right from Congress to ACL to the centers. If I'm off on that, feel free to correct me, either Susan or Kathy.
Probably just add that the biggest distinction is the Part B money goes directly to the state. And so that's why we have the designated state entities that usually contract that money out with the SILC and the centers, or for whatever other things that state is doing with the IL. So that's probably the biggest thing.
Yeah, it's our experience that the federal centers for independent living, the Part C funded centers, really don't care about the designated state entity at all. There's really no connection for them, at least in Pennsylvania. Do we go to the next slide? Or does that answer the question?
I'm thinking so.
Fair enough. What are we on slide 9?
So I can kind of take this one. Originally, Kim Connors from the Washington SILC was going to be on this presentation with us as well, but unfortunately she wasn't able to. But she did send us some of the stuff from the Washington SILC just to give a whole nother perspective, another state perspective. And so what she sent us was that Washington SILC, wrote a spill amendment addressing the closure in some detail, and to keep the funding in the area with the closed SIL, to identify a SIL that will take on Part C funding to develop and spin off a new SIL within 3 years, and develop outreach strategies to include BIPOC and other marginalized communities within service areas to take part in the role of the development of the new center. And then she listed some outcomes that they worked with OILP, the IL network, and outreach to community, BIPOC, and public hearings. So their spill amendment was not approved. The reason, per consultation with ACL lawyers, was the IL network cannot direct ACL on who they should be contracting with. And then ACL has to conduct a fair notice of funding opportunity process. And I think this is a good point because, we talk about all this stuff in our spill, and in Kansas, and I'm sure in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure in every other state, we get super detailed because we learned our lesson from ARA. We've learned our lesson from getting some of these additional federal funds. And so we got super detailed, and we said, if this happens, then we want this, this, and this. But here ACL is kind of saying that, well, you know, you don't get to make that decision on some stuff. We still do. And again, this is not to open a whole nother can of worms, but with the whole redistribution of Part C funding discussion that has been happening over the last year or so, you know, this is kind of what we're seeing happen, is that ACL has to figure out, well, you know, they're the contracting agent, how do they still do it? So it's just a reminder on that kind of stuff. Questions from the president. How will state IL networks redistribute Part C funds if they do not have the autonomy nor ability to direct ACL/OILP on how they should contract with? If states redirect, then to be fair, does that mean there would be a notice a funding opportunity process for every new SIL redistricting? And what other areas will this affect? So just some good things from Washington Silk, and we appreciate that she was able to at least give us another perspective from there. So hopefully this kind of opens up people's minds, and maybe they have some questions. Again, the question and answer or the chat, or raise your hand, and we'd love to hear from some other people on what they've come up against with, or what they've done in their state as well.
Yeah, again, I think we're learning here as well. Like Kathy said, this is an evolving process. So there's always going to be things that we come up against that haven't dealt with before. So we can learn from you and you can learn from us. That's what we're trying to accomplish.
So this is Melly again. If you can put a question in the Q&A, which is on your menu bar, and or raise your hand, then Sierra will open up your microphone so that you can share questions or comments.
Do you want to talk about some SILs that have closed or have been restructured, Susan?
Well, I was going to say we could go into a little bit more depth explanation of how we, I guess, rehabilitated a couple of the SILs.
Yeah.
In the first case, this was still when RSA was our overriding agency. We had a federal SIL that was failing, and it had to do with administration, and they weren't meeting consumers' needs, and they weren't fulfilling their duties. And RSA came to one of the executive directors of another federally funded SIL in our state and asked him if he would be willing to go in to this other SIL, basically clean house and start from scratch. So he and his SIL agreed to do that. They went in. It was a 2-year process. They pretty much fired the executive director. They dismissed their board of directors. They did extensive training with the staff, hired a new executive director. They were able to put together a new board of directors that completely understood the independent living philosophy, really took over every aspect of the running of their SIL as they identified and hired or promoted staff into positions. They were trained specifically for that job. And when the end of the 2 years arrived, that SIL was successfully able to carry on. And the SIL that was doing the training went back to their own, and that SIL is still running well and has not suffered in the least from having that experience. So
We are currently, right now, we have a center that is rehabilitating. It is a state-funded center, so ACL really has no involvement in it. So it's more on a state level. But that state, or that center, I should say, realized itself that they had problems after a lot of prompting. I don't want to say we weren't involved. We were involved, but the end result came about by the actions of their own board in firing their director and bringing in another center to help rehabilitate them, just to find out what problems they really had, because they didn't even know. But that process is still ongoing as we speak.
Thank you. We do have one question, and that is, what does the acronym OILP stand for?
Office of Independent Living Programs, I believe.
Yes.
I believe that's underneath the ACL umbrella. Administration for Community Living.
So another kind of point of view, sometimes when we talk about SILCS closing, some people might be thinking, well, what does a SILC have to do with that? And there's lots of different areas where the SILC can be very helpful in the SILC closing from a network perspective. I'm thinking about some of the things that have happened in Kansas, and like I mentioned earlier, when our centers have closed, they haven't necessarily had a brand new center start up, but what's happened is another center has absorbed that territory. And things that can happen when another center absorbs a territory, it's important to know the funding source, the money, how much money was there, because what we have found that has happened in Kansas over the past 15 or so years is that a center might have been receiving so much money from the state. This is just a total random number, $300,000. Let's just use that. And then when the new center absorbed it, we find out later that only $200,000 was used for the continuation of that territory coverage. So I think that's where SILC can come in to play here, is to understand how the funding for the statewide network is set up, how much is out there, how much is being used. I'm constantly looking at and asking for information on what is the total amount that the state is spending. You need that for the spill anyway. You've got that fiscal piece of the spill. And I use that, and I asked just recently, like the DSC, I said, can you tell me how much each center has received in their grants from the state? Because like I said, we have 10, 9 of the 10 centers do receive some type of funding from our state. And when I added it all up, we were $20,000 short, which isn't a huge chunk of change, but it is something. And so I've asked the DSC for that information. Where's that $20,000? And that's important because, you know, when you start looking at that, you think, well, it's 20,000 this year. What is it over the last 10 years? And so then I went back and I added up, or I looked at how much we had received since 2005 from our spills. And it turns out that we were $400,000 short as a network, from what we had been receiving in 2008. So that's a handy thing to know, that when centers close, not all the money gets reused. And if you know that, it's easy to go to the DSC and say, hey, here's where we're at, what can we do?
I was going to add something, and I noticed a question about the distance, which I can kind of address indirectly. We had another center. It didn't necessarily close, but the director was leaving, and so this is on Western Pennsylvania, not necessarily Pittsburgh, but Erie. If anybody's familiar with Erie, Pennsylvania, you know, Erie Lake and all that, the Great Lake, and Southwestern Pennsylvania. I don't know, there's probably 300 miles between them. And when the director, maybe some of you know her, Kathleen Kleinman, she was retiring, you know, I mean, best wishes to you, Kathleen. When she retired, Shauna Aiken, who maybe some of you also know, who is the director in the Erie area, the plan was for them to take over this SIL and be manage both SILCS. They were going to try to do that from a distance, and they have now for, I don't know, it's probably been 2 years that they've been running that, and it's worked out really well. The only problem I kind of saw in it was the grants had to stay separate because they were receiving one grant from ACL and the other grant from the state. So even though they're considered the same entity, they have 2 grants, but that's working for them. But I could see how that could work in a situation where one of them closed, is I guess my point.
Thanks, Matt. This is Melly. I just want to remind the panelists of the question. What if there are no nearby centers to redirect consumers to? Do they have to go without assistance? So just wanted to see if someone wanted to jump in and provide a little bit more explanation about that.
Well, this is Kathy again. I think this is, it all depends on how your state is set up. I know that not all states have all their counties or territories covered by centers. So Kansas is fortunate to be able to say all 105 counties. But when you really look at that, we can say they're covered, but they're definitely underserved. So if a center closes and there's not a close other center to just absorb it, if it's not easy, if it's hundreds of miles away to the nearest center, what do you do? Well, I mean, yeah, sometimes they're going to go without assistance, and but that's why I think that really having a solid network, coming together, the SILCS and the CILs, and having a plan to determine what are you going to do if that happens? How are you going to serve those people? What's the plan? And it's exactly what we did in Kansas, and you can do it. Any state can do it. And I know that not all the centers get along. Some of the SILCS and the centers don't get along. I get it. It can be tumultuous. But if your goal truly is, how can we serve people? How can we make sure that people have the services they need? Then you put that stuff aside and you come together and you say, what's our plan? What are we going to do? And sometimes it means one SIL has 38 counties and they cover a great distance of land for your state. So it's going to be different for every, I don't know, what do you guys do in Pennsylvania?
We're absolutely in the same boat. We have one center that covers 10 counties. We don't exactly have, we have 67?
7.
Not quite 105, but we have one center that covers 10 counties. We have another center that covers 1. So it's a mixed bag. Obviously, that one county is, well, not obviously, that's our Philadelphia Center for Independent Living. Obviously, there's a lot more population in that one county than possibly all 10 of those counties, but every county is covered. No more questions?
This is Melly. Just as a reminder, you can raise your hand on the bottom menu bar, and we can open up your microphone if you'd like to ask your question live, or you can use the Q&A feature on the menu bar and ask it that way, or make comments. This is Melly. One thing that I will say, I will put my video on for a moment here. I didn't say this in my introduction as the moderator for this session, but I'm the state administrator for the Arizona Statewide Independent Living Council. And this last go round of SPIL development, because the new tool was also a lot more specific in making sure that these sorts of issues were addressed. We spend a lot of time with our IL network in talking through all of this and sort of trying to think about what this is like. And we only have 5 centers. They do claim all of our 15 counties. Of course, our counties in Arizona are ginormous because we are a large land mass state, but we just don't have a lot of counties. They are covered, but as others have mentioned, not necessarily covered well. But in thinking about it, we were sort of like, oh, it's never going to happen to us, but let's just make sure that we do it. And then this year we had a longtime director who left their position, kind of left one of our smaller centers a little bit shaky. It's all worked out, but it just really is really critical. And I think it's interesting. And if there are, and I know that there are, because I've seen the list of attendees, you know, SILCS, people who are serving on SILC or who are working for a SILC here, you know, I found it really valuable to kind of go to the websites of other statewide independent living councils, pull up their spill, take a look at what they're doing, and kind of thinking through it, because, you know, you think it might not ever happen to you, but it happens. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I see another question. Have any of you had a federally funded SIL close since ACL became the administrator of IL funding? If so, was ACL easier to work with on this than RSA?
Pennsylvania did. It was our center in Pittsburgh, and the process was different than with RSA. I don't know if I would say it was simpler. They needed a whole lot of information from us, and they wanted things very specific to the, you know, every T crossed, every I dotted. We had to amend our spill. I just feel like they were a whole lot more involved, the ACL group, than RSA ever was.
I would say that's probably one of the main takeaways here, is that if the SILC wants to have input into that process, it's got to be in the state plan. I mean, again, ours isn't perfect. I mean, I'm reading Kathy's and I'm like, oh, wow, we need some of that. But if you don't have anything, ACL is going to do what they think is best, rather than what SILC and arguably, well, PA SILC and arguably what Pennsylvania would think is best, if you follow my logic there.
Great. We have a couple of questions. The first one is, one thing that was suggested to us when writing this bill was to ensure that our plan to cover a closed SIL until decisions were finalized did not give any one SIL a leg up should they decide to put in when the RFP opened. Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a good way to do it, quite honestly, because what happened in Kansas, again, when the two centers and the DSC just tried to work it out themselves, while it did work out in the end, there were some tensions that happened because the rest of the network was not involved in it, and that's what we had all agreed upon. So I think it's a good idea, especially if you want your network to work together, which ultimately you do. Like I said, not every center has to agree on the same types of things or you know, or whatever, but the basic goal is that you're serving as many people as you possibly can. So I think that's a good idea.
Thanks, Kathy. Another question here is, can we discuss possible supports available through SILCS and or ACL for a SIL who is in danger of closing?
That's a great question. And I love that question because I would rather deal with it before it happens than after the fact. In Kansas, the SILC, I personally will reach out to every single center director and work with them. And we have a new center director that has just started and taken over a center. And, you know, a lot of times they, you know, it's just human nature, I think, for people to not want to feel like they don't know everything. And so I'm kind of that easier person to go to and ask all those questions and give the resources. I have tried to help struggling center directors out and help them with different aspects of it. I've worked at a couple of centers before I ever came to the SILC, so I do understand IL and centers and pretty much have done every job you can do in a center. So I think that's helpful. But yeah, I always open myself up as a resource to centers for independent living.
I think we do
When
the
we-
same. Go ahead, Susan.
I was just gonna say, when our center in Pittsburgh closed, they hadn't told anyone. So we didn't know it was going to happen. So now with the language we've inserted into our SIL, if your center is in any kind of difficult circumstances, shaky ground, you have to notify ACL, and we need to be part of that discussion as well. So go ahead, Matt.
In addition to that, I mean, it's not always the director or the staff. Sometimes it's the board. Some boards are particularly hard to work with, or for the director to work with. And we've heard that a lot lately. Sometimes the board needs some education. SILC will help out. I've been in contact with a lot of members of boards. How can you help us through this? The board I was just referring to earlier, the state funded one. And some have reached out to Susan directly. But yeah, we're trying to, we want services to continue. I believe that's like the ultimate goal. We don't want any consumer to go without a service that they need. So that's our ultimate objective. And we've tried to do that. Pennsylvania, I'm not sure how many other states have this. We also have a membership organization for the Centers for Independent Living, like a trade association. So SILs can pay a fee and be a part of that. And that's peer support. They can reach out to other directors. They can also do that through the SILC for the SIL directors and members that are members of our board. But they can also go to that body as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The next question is for Kathy. This person knows that Kansas has the Kansas Youth Empowerment Academy. And the question is, have you ever collaborated with the Kansas Youth Empowerment Academy to support youth in a SIL service area if that SIL closed?
Gosh. Well, yes and no. We used to have the Kansas Youth Empowerment Academy as a standing agenda item on every SILC board meeting, and we would want to hear from them on what they were doing in the programs and all that. We had a section in our SPIL because we actually gave them some of the Part B money at one time. So we had a section in our SPIL that talked about collaborating with the Youth Empowerment Academy and all the centers, and that we would come together again as a network and talk about how to best serve the youth in those areas. So that would have been for a closing SIL as well. Programs change, things happen. We no longer have that in our SPIL, we no longer have them on our agenda. I think that they just took a different direction, and we kind of went with that. So at this point, no, I would not say that we directly work with them for youth services. I will say that pretty much every center for independent living in Kansas has its own youth program as well. So I think that's probably more where our efforts are focused.
Great. Next is a comment. RSA did not find a suitable group to take over the SIL that closed in our state. Our SILs and SILC wanted RSA to split the money evenly between all SILs for 1 year and do another call for proposals. RSA refused to do this. The SILs were willing to use the money for 1 year and then give it up the following year to restart the SIL in the area where we had a SIL close. It was very frustrating. Any follow-up comments from the panelists?
I just wonder how they would have responded if you had amended your state plan to say that. I mean, it's not an easy process, but I don't know. I did not personally deal with RSA, so.
RSA was historically difficult to deal with in pretty much any capacity. I would say the only protection you would have had would have been if you had foreknowledge and were able to have put that into your spill. But if you had amended your spill, I would be very curious if they would have had the leg to stand on once you had a spill amendment, but they also have to sign off on that spill amendment. So let's just say it's been a completely different experience working with ACL as opposed to the difficulties with RSA.
Thanks, Susan. The person followed up and said, we did agree to amend our state plan to do this, and RSA said did not matter as they would not let us do it anyway, or do it that way.
That's really, really unfortunate. It was my experience, and I should probably mention, I've been either an employee or am currently the chair of the Pennsylvania SILC, and that goes back to 1999. So yes, I'm that old. RSA, we often dealt with people who had a very, we'll just say a very high opinion of themselves and the amount of power they could throw around. And you know, the bottom line is we're all trying to make sure that our consumers are being served. And I don't know how that relationship ever worked well. It didn't in Pennsylvania. And I'm glad there's ACL now, that we don't have to deal with all that RSA has been in the past.
No offense to any former RSA employees on the call.
And this is Melly. We have about 10 minutes left. So any final questions or comments and or final words from the panelists?
Well, this is Kathy again. I think my final thoughts would be just don't be afraid to push back on the DSC when they're not following the spill, because truly you put so much time and effort into developing that spill and having everybody agree on it. So yeah, don't be afraid to push back.
I would probably say the same. We've been getting more and more resistance, not necessarily with this issue from our DSE, and we've been pushing back more and more. And you know, this isn't the way it's done. You know, we're kind of, I think in Pennsylvania, we're tired of hearing that. So we're trying to do what's best for the population that we serve, not necessarily what's best for the state or the feds or whatever. As long as Susan approves.
Yeah, just if you don't have language in your spill, I would strongly suggest that you start working on it now and make sure that it does make it into your spill. It is essential that you do that.
Yeah, that's the huge takeaway. If you don't put something in there, they're going to do what they want to do, whoever they is.
And this is Melly. I just wanted to let everyone know that I did put the survey link in the chat for the evaluation. So please feel free to copy that over, and you can also find it on our wonderful platform. And there are a couple of comments here. This was a great discussion. Thank you. Any final comments or questions? This is the time. Oh, wait, here we have one. Is there a way to find out if my state's spill has any language about when SILCS close?
I mean, we put ours on our webpage, and it's open to anyone to look at. It's a public document, so you should be able to see it. If your SILC doesn't put it on the webpage or have it available in some way, they should. And if they don't, I believe there's a way to look it up on the ACL website, but I personally have not done that.
Another question, where would you suggest SILCS start on this if no SIL has closed to spark the discussion? So if they've never had that experience, where would you suggest they start discussing what, how they should move forward?
Well, this is Kathy, and I would say take a look at Kansas or Pennsylvania. Like Matt said, we'll share any of our stuff with you. Just because it hasn't happened, it probably will happen. But there's lots of other things to think about in that. And those spills get a little bit ridiculous in the fact that we have to like pre-plan for everything and try and think of everything. But this is probably a very important one to do some pre-planning on and take a look. Regardless of whether a center completely closes, you can have language in there about what to do if a center is in trouble, if nothing else, or if funding gets cut in one way or another, whether it be federal money or state money, or if there's an increase in money. You really need to have those important pieces covered. And again, I feel very confident in the Kansas spill in those areas, maybe not in everything, but at least in those areas, we put a lot of thought into that, and I'm more than happy to share.
Yeah, like Kathy said, we're happy to share. But in the end, there's always the all-knowing and always helpful Anne from West Virginia, who is, I can't, thank her enough for all that she's helped us with. So, even though I know she's phasing out, and don't leave me.
Someone mentioned in the chat that spills are not yet uploaded to ACL's website, but to contact your SILC to request a copy of their spill if it is not readily available on their website. We have 5 minutes remaining. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, or is that it? Are we left with thank yous, or no one has any questions?
Can we put our emails up there? Because we've just said over and over, hey, emails, and yet they don't have that. So can you maybe
the last slide of the presentation?
Yeah, throw the last slide up there, Melly, or Sierra, or whoever's doing it.
And while Sierra's putting that up, we do have one question. How could one prepare for pushback when planning this?
I mean, put it in there that you expect that part of the plan is that your network gets to have some type of feedback in this. Now, in Kansas, in our Part B stuff, we know that the state is the grantee, and we know that the state gets a say in how the RFP is and all that kind of stuff. But we have specifically put in there that they have to collaborate with us and consider our recommendations before anything can happen. Now, if they don't take those recommendations, well, there's not a lot we can do other than raise a fuss about it. But it's at least in there that they have to collaborate with us. It cannot be done in a silo.
I would also say, though, that no one ever thinks this is going to happen to them. And I mean, hopefully it doesn't. But, everyone's got ego and whatever. So you never think your SIL is going to close. So when we did this, we didn't get a lot of backlash or resistance, because there's the SILs probably in everyone's network that people that SIL's in trouble, or that SIL may have trouble or whatever. But everyone else feels like everything's great. So they were all willing to sign on, and really we didn't ask a lot of them. If you're going to have problems, if you see something coming down the road, just bring it to us, bring it to the membership organization, bring it to the DSC, and let us help you through it. That's really the objective of that. It's not, we're not looking for them to close. We don't want any SIL to close, because that's going to affect consumers in the end, which we don't want to happen.
All right, with that, I think we will go ahead and thank our presenters, Kathy, Matt, and Susan, for their time and expertise today. We appreciate that. We want to also recognize the hard work of our ASL interpreters and our cart operator, and of course, Sierra, for hosting this today. And we hope that we will see you back this afternoon and throughout the rest of the week for the wonderful 2021 April conference. Thank you all.